Assalamu alaikum students. Here is one more important thing to learn. Relative clause. It's an introduction of relative clause. First of all, let us see what a relative clause actually is. It's a subordinate clause which is introduced by a relative pronoun. We have already learned about a subordinate clause in the previous lecture. A subordinate clause which is introduced by a relative pronoun. For example, in the given, if we look at the example, Peter who writes novels. This writes novels is a subordinate clause. It is introduced by who. This who is basically a relative pronoun. Writes novels is a subordinate clause. It contains the element whose interpretation is provided by an antecedent. This Peter, this is antecedent. The element which this relative clause provides, it provides us information about the antecedent, that's Peter, on which the subordinate clause is grammatically dependent. Okay, Peter, antecedent, we will discuss these terms later on. Peter who writes novels lives in Chicago. Writes novels, this is a subordinate clause, dependent clause, or we can say this dependent clause is introduced by a relative pronoun, that's who here. It gives us information. It contains the element that whose interpretation is provided by an antecedent. So it gives us information. This clause gives us information about Peter. Okay, let us see what does a relative pronoun is. What actually a relative pronoun is. A pronoun that contains or that introduces a relative clause referring to some antecedent. In the given example, who is a relative pronoun because it introduced a relative clause which refers to an antecedent. A pronoun that introduces a relative clause. This who it has introduced writes novels. This refers to Peter. So there are basically 5 relative pronouns: who, which, that, whose, whom. We will discuss them one by one later on. Let us see what does an antecedent mean. The referent of an anaphor, a phrase or clause that is referred by an anaphoric pronoun. Antecedent, if in a simple language, if we explain it, if we define it in a simple language, antecedent means predecessor, as you can imagine it, as you can understand it from maths point of view. Predecessor is something that comes before. Predecessors, you might have learned about predecessors, successors. Antecedent is basically a predecessor. We can say in the language of history, we say ancestors. Like my parents are my ancestors. My parents are my predecessors as well. So antecedent is basically a predecessor. It comes before a relative pronoun. Like we see here, Peter is an antecedent because right after comes relative pronoun. It is the referent of an anaphor. In the second sentence, when we make two sentences into a relative clause, In the second sentence, there is a pronoun, that there is an anaphoric pronoun, like I have written here John. If in the second sentence we use John, we will use he or him or his. Like in the given examples, I have written here John works in a hospital. He helps the poor and needy. In the second sentence, it refers to John. Okay. So John is basically its predecessor. From John, he has been extracted. He is the anaphoric pronoun of John. Okay, let us see a few more examples. John works in a hospital. He helps the poor and needy. John becomes antecedent because he has been he is the post form of John. John who helps the poor. Who is introduced here? Who is a relative pronoun. It introduces a relative clause, helps the poor and needy. This is basically a subordinate clause. It gives us information about John. John who helps the poor and needy works in a hospital. In the second example, I saw a man, he was blind. It is man here, and in the second sentence there is he. I saw a man who was blind. Man is antecedent, who is relative pronoun, and rest of the sentence is relative clause. Okay, so relative clause is basically it is a subordinate clause. It is introduced by a relative pronoun. Relative pronoun comes right after an antecedent. Antecedent is it's a reference of an anaphoric pronoun. We will give you a few more examples. Here are a few more examples. Raju makes beautiful paintings. He earns good money. Raju and he. Raju will become an antecedent here. Raju, then it is comma, who, relative pronoun, earns good money. Since we used Raju, this he will omit automatically. Raju, who earns good money, makes beautiful paintings. Peter plays chess. He is very intelligent. Peter, who is very intelligent, plays chess. Kashmir is known as paradise of earth. It attracts millions of tourists. Kashmir, which attracts millions of tourists, is known as paradise of earth. This was all about relative clause, just an introduction. In the next video, we will see how can we make a relative clause, what are the rules, what are the things to remember, and we will introduce a few more relative pronouns. Like I used only one or two here. We will see separately, one by one, which relative pronoun is used on what we can say on what occasions. Okay, that's it. Thank you. Have a nice day ahead.